Hello and welcome everyone to the Faculty Spotlight event series brought to you by the Johns Hopkins University Masters of Liberal Arts program and the Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features Dr. Michael Harding discussing Historicism and Tragic Atheism in Nietzsche. My name is Peter Huggins and I'm the event producer. Please note, today's program will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Masters of Liberal Arts playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A function and we'll answer as many questions as possible during the Q&A portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the event to the Masters of Liberal Arts Associate Program Director, Dr. Tristan Cabello.
Everybody, and Tristan Cabello. I'm the Associate Director of the Master of Liberal Arts, the MLA, at Johns Hopkins University. And tonight is the first event of our Faculty Spotlight series, which will run during the whole spring semester. And this series will try to showcase the diversity of courses that students can take in the program and also the research that our faculty members are doing. And as you know, the Master of Liberal Arts is an interdisciplinary program. You can therefore take different courses in different disciplines and different topics such as music, literature, gender studies, or sociology. And you can take also courses in philosophy with one of our professors, my colleague, Dr. Michael Harding. Dr. Harding teaches philosophy in the MLA program. He received this PhD in politics from the Institute of Philosophic Studies at the University of Dallas. His research and teaching focus on the history of political philosophy and American political theory. And he's also a specialist of Plato, Aristotle, Locke, and Nietzsche. Dr. Harding is going to give a 35-minute presentation, and then we'll have a few minutes for a question and answers at the end. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to read through a draft of something I've been working on that is going to address the connection between Nietzsche's early analysis of what we might call the discovery of history in the German philosopher Hegel and his later claim that, as it's infamously known, that God is dead. So with that, we're looking at one of his early writings and then his later thought. I'm going to try to show that there's really a very close connection between them. So first section, progressive and nihilistic historicism. What Nietzsche in the second meditation calls the historical sense can take two forms. One that can be characterized as nihilistic in that it destroys horizons simply, and one rooted in Hegel that can be labeled progressive in that it's based on a claim of cosmological or historical teleology. According to Nietzsche, progressive historicism presents a specific moral danger because it conceives of history as the teleological unfolding of a rational process, ultimately denying the importance of human action and human engagement. Hegel claims, quote, the cunning of reason, by which he means this governing principle, this governing teleological principle of history, allows the passions to work for it. In other words, the individual psychological drives of what Hegel calls world historical men unknowingly advance the historical process. This, claims Nietzsche, fosters a disinterested perspective on the past, which views the present as being the necessary end result of the world historical process. This view also promotes a lack of interest in the present as well. If current conditions are the result of the necessary unfolding of the Hegelian Geist in the world, the first traces of which Hegel claims virtually contain all history, then everything that is must be precisely what is required at this particular moment for the continued unfolding of Geist and the achievement of what Hegel calls the final goal of the world, which is Geist's consciousness of its own freedom. Nietzsche, and this is going to be a fairly long quotation, I apologize in advance. Nietzsche describes this as, quote, the sojourn of God on earth, which God, however, is himself first produced by history. But this God has become transparent and intelligible to himself inside the Hegelian craniums and has already ascended all possible dialectical steps of his becoming up to that self-revelation. So that for Hegel, The apex and terminus of world history coincided with his own Berlin existence. He should even have said that all things after him are properly judged to be only a musical coda of the world historical rondo, more properly yet to be redundant. He did not say that. So he implanted in the generation thoroughly leavened by him that admiration for the power of history, which at practically every moment turns into naked admiration for success and leads to the idolatry of the factual. But who once has learned to bend his back and bow his head before the power of history finally nods his yes mechanically to every power, be this a government or a public opinion or a numerical majority, and moves his limbs precisely in the tempo in which some power or other pulls the string. That's the end of the long quote. So Nietzsche's claim is that the Hegelian view promotes a kind of mechanical yes saying to whatever the contemporary situations are. This has the effect, he says, of undermining virtue, which in the second untimely meditation, Nietzsche presented as being grounded in the fight against one's time, rather than the docile acceptance of it. The human being, writes Nietzsche, quote, is virtuous only because he was outraged by that blind power of facts, by the tyranny of the actual. He always swims against the historical waves. The view of history as progressive counteracts the kind of thumatic engagement that Nietzsche claims to find at the root of both individual virtue and the possibility of greatness. And this applies to the political world as well. The world process moved towards an end. And if this is the, quote, end of history, then this is the final state or the world state. If it's not yet the end of history, it is still a necessary way station along the path toward that end. And according to Hegel, the state, however it might be constituted at a given time, is, quote, the divine idea or Geist as it exists on earth. If the real is identical with the ideal, each individual is simply a cog in the great world historical machine. And what one does is done, however unwittingly, for the sake of the advancement of the process. Furthermore, such a belief may lead to a decline. If the real and the ideal are identical, then whatever one is oneself must be the ideal or a requirement of the ideal. Thus, Nietzsche notes that one believes oneself to be in possession of virtues that are lacking. The possibility of human greatness that Nietzsche claims stems from a thumatic antagonism toward the world as it is, finds itself undermined by the claim that the world as it is and as it ought to be are ultimately identical. Nietzsche admits that the historical sense, quote, preserves the great fighters against history and serves to mitigate some of the moral danger, quote, by singling out just those as the proper historical natures who concern themselves very little with the so it is, but rather followed a so it must be. However, this kind of historical sense is not the metaphysical teleological historicism of Hegelianism, but rather memory of the past. And the metaphysical teleological historicism of Hegelianism can absorb such examples by noting that even though such individuals may have thought they opposed history, the cunning of reason ensured that they did what the Geist required for its own further progression. Thus, there is nothing to strive against. Hegelian progressive historicism assumes that, as Karl Loveth notes, the success of something proves its superior right to that which is unsuccessful. The rejection or struggle against the contemporary that Nietzsche identifies as the source of virtue can only be vice from this point of view, and the untimely thinker is simply a bad human being. Hegelian progressive historicism, however, transforms into what we can characterize as nihilistic historicism, what Nietzsche names the youngest virtue, Redlichkeit, which we can translate as probity, or more accurately describe as a kind of relentless honesty, turns against the progressive dimension of historicism, which is weakened and finally eliminated. Historicism, which claimed to be the final and most complete horizon, subverts itself and is transformed into a horizon destructive of all horizons, and therefore destructive of life through what Nietzsche calls the thoughtless displacement of all perspectives. In place of those perspectives, he says, are, quote, the doctrines of sovereign becoming, of the fluidity of all concepts, types, and kinds, of the lack of any cardinal difference between man and the animal. These, quote, true but deadly doctrines present the world as it appears after Redlichkeit or probity has displaced the progressive metaphysics of Hegelian historicism. The illusions that rendered life possible have been destroyed, first by the Hegelian undermining of the capacity to live on historically, and then by the destruction of the metaphysics of progress. Loveth rightly notes that at the beginning of Nietzsche's philosophy stands the death of God. Nietzsche himself divides his early and middle period at the line separating the Meditations and Human All Too Human, the latter of which he describes as liberating him from all infection of higher feelings and idealism. Nietzsche's account of the moral crisis occasioned by historicism presages the death of God even before Nietzsche himself has employed this terminology. The displacement of perspectives and the destruction of Hegelian progressive metaphysics are crucial components of the phenomena he will later describe as the death of God. Hence, he even retains the language of horizons in his later formulation, even though he may understand the origin differently. To get a sense of the importance of horizons for Nietzsche's overall thought, Nietzsche's later use of the term might well be considered. In The Gay Science, the madman claims that the death of God has quote, wiped away the entire horizon, unchained the earth from its sun. The horizon is the limit of our awareness, carried with us. All that we encounter is encountered within a horizon. It's a condition of experience that mediates our interpretation of experience, or we could call it an experiential structure that informs the interpretation of experience, which interpretations can be harmful or helpful to life. The well-constituted horizon, Nietzsche says, can be a condition for the preservation and enhancement of life. It can function as a value or a source of values in the language of Nietzsche's later thought. But when horizons are seen as horizons, they are weakened, appearing as arbitrary cultural or social constructions. As such, they suggest that there is no particular necessity at work in the way of life adopted by an individual or a people. Even the Copernican revolution, Nietzsche says, is seen as harmful in this regard. Quote, since Copernicus, man seems to have got himself on an inclined plane. Now he is slipping faster and faster away from the center into what? Into nothingness? Into a penetrating sense of his nothingness? The horizon is a system of meaning by which human beings make sense of all that they experience. This system of meaning includes our moral and political categories, and the truth or falsity of it is, for Nietzsche, of much less importance than the utility of it for life. The death of God wipes away that horizon, and human beings become unmoored. Again, from Nietzsche in The Gay Science. Where are we moving to, the madman asks? Away from all suns? Are we not continually falling, and backwards, sidewards, forwards, as in all directions? Is there still an up and a down? Aren't we straying as though through an infinite nothing? As Nietzsche writes in The Will to Power, quote, we are losing the burden that allowed us to live. For some time, we will not know whether we are coming or going. Poetically presenting the effects of the deadly truth, Nietzsche's madman emphasizes the cold and dark character of existence after the death of God, which is an expansion of the fundamental insight into the deadly truth of absolute becoming. Existence after the death of God is identical to what we earlier called nihilistic historicism, insofar as there is no longer an authoritative horizon by which to take one's bearings. Now, in the second meditation, the doctrines revealed by historical science are presented by Nietzsche, as I've said, as being true but deadly. The doctrine of sovereign becoming effectively denies that there is unity or order to be found in the flux of becoming. There is nothing underlying or grounding the flux of experience. There's neither a God or eternal Platonic forms. So both revealed religion and the metaphysics that supported Western moral and political institutions have lost their foundations. The recognition of the sovereignty of becoming is a stage in the collapse of all otherworldliness, either that of Christianity or revealed religion or of metaphysics. The, quote, fluidity of all concepts, types, and kinds is the application of sovereign becoming to the things of the mind. That is simply to say that concepts or ideas are as historically fluid as all being. Consequently, truth is relative to history or to perspective. This, however, is to deny the possibility of universal and timeless truths, which is harmful in that many human beings require such beliefs, even if they're false, as conditions of life, according to Nietzsche. Lastly, the lack of difference between man and the animal. the application of historical consciousness to the biological sciences and evolutionary theory serves to undermine the previously life-giving view that there was something crucial about the human being that separated it from the animal. Thus, nascent evolutionary biology undermines the belief in reason as a distinguishing characteristic, or the belief that humanity is made in the image and likeness of God. Again, such life-giving beliefs are false for Nietzsche, but their falseness is not itself an objection to them, provided they have a utility for life, i.e. they promote strength and health rather than decline and decadence. Not discounting the importance of modern science, for God, it seems, has many murderers, historicism or historical consciousness is linked in 1881's Daybreak with the death of God in 1882's The Gay Science in a fairly straightforward manner. Historical consciousness gives rise to a historical or historically based atheism. In the past, writes Nietzsche, quote, one sought to prove that there is no God. Today, one indicates how the belief that there is a God could arise and how this belief acquired its weight and importance. A counterproof that there is no God becomes superfluous. Historical consciousness asks the genealogical question of how such a belief came to be. This proves more effective for the advocates of atheism, because rather than refuting the arguments traditionally advanced in favor of the existence of God, which could conceivably be replaced with stronger arguments, it simply acts as an explanation in regard to the question of how the belief in God came to be. It's an approach that's ultimately indifferent to the ontotheological question. Though this section of Daybreak is titled, quote, historical refutation as the definitive refutation, it has to be confessed that the historical refutation presented therein is not, in fact, a definitive refutation, precisely because it sidesteps the ontotheological question. As a historical argument, it is a genealogical argument concerned with the genesis and origin of a belief, rather than the ontological status of the object of that belief, which Nietzsche suggests allows the atheist to, quote, make a clean sweep. The turn to history does not refute God's existence. At best, the genealogical account may make it difficult or impossible to believe in God's existence going forward by presenting an alternative explanation that attacks the faith of those teetering on the edge of unbelief. But there's no reason to assume that human beliefs must be an accurate reflection of what is actually the case. Rather, such beliefs may be divorced from reality, and as Nietzsche notes, the falsity of a belief is not thereby cause for the rejection of a belief. False beliefs may yet be life-sustaining or life-affirming, and life for Nietzsche is a higher standard than truth. The idealist and the theist both hold notions, Nietzsche suggests, that may be necessary for their preservation. But, he writes, what presumption is it to decree that whatever is necessary for my preservation must actually exist? Nietzsche closes this section with the exclamation, as if my preservation were something necessary. How if others felt in the opposite way? If those two articles of faith were precisely the conditions under which they did not wish to live and under which they no longer found life worth living? And this is how things are now. His point is that things were not that way in the past. Such beliefs were, at one time, life-sustaining or life-affirming, but have now ceased to be so. They are refuted on the level of action, perhaps, but that does not approach refutation on the level of ontotheology. The historical/genealogical approach to monotheism undermines the belief in God, and atheism is prevented both in section 95 of Daybreak and section 125 of The Gay Science by Nietzsche as ultimately a historical event. There's another discussion just prior to the historical refutation, however, a section titled, quote, God's honesty, which takes up the question of direct and easily apprehensible divine revelation. But this section doesn't address itself to ontotheology either. Rather, like the later account found in Beyond Good and Evil, section 53, it's ultimately a moral objection, though perhaps more serious than the objection presented in section 53 of Beyond Good and Evil. The quote, Deus absconditus, who does not or cannot communicate clearly, must, Nietzsche writes, either endure almost the torments of hell to have to see his creatures suffer so, if such a God is good, or simply be a cruel God. This is merely a moral objection, however, as is the claim that God as Father, Judge, Rewarder, and being possessing free will have all been refuted. Nietzsche doesn't offer a challenge to ontotheology on its own grounds. Rather, he offers a historical account and a moral account, which is to say, a psychological or genealogical account of the fall of theism. And he offers in his mature thought an account of the world in which the high comes to be derived from the low. It is this second aspect of his thought, the derivation of the high from the low, embodied in the discussion of the will to power, that offers an actual alternative to theism by providing a non-theistic cosmology. Nietzsche doesn't offer proofs against the existence of God. Ontotheology has not so much been refuted as abandoned by the West, and the god of ontotheology became a god of the gaps. The more those gaps came to be filled in by sciences, the more philology undermined the texts of divine revelation, and the more genealogical method provided a historical account of the development of belief, the more this god was pushed away and finally forgotten. In light of all this, the relativism of so-called truth becomes apparent. Horizons come to be known as horizons, whether they are the personal horizons of the individual, formed by one's own personal history, or the broader cultural horizons formed by the agglomeration of individual horizons. This means that all concepts, types, and kinds are seen to be perspectives, and no perspective is to be privileged above any other. These doctrines, Nietzsche says, are, quote, flung at the people because of, quote, the current mania for education, but without thought as to their moral effect. The end result of this, he says, will be the disintegration of peoples as peoples. They will be replaced by what Nietzsche describes as, quote, systems of individual egoism, fellowships intent on the rapacious exploitation of non-fellows, and similar creations of utilitarian vulgarity. The lack of shared and authoritative horizons, or in the language of Nietzsche's Zarathustra, the lack of common tables of value, means that human life no longer occurs within the life-giving constraints of a horizon or culture. In place of a shared sense of purpose common to all, individuals pursue their own desires at the expense of any higher end or purpose. Lack of shared moral purpose and moral restraint means that one pursues rapaciously one's own satisfaction at the expense of all others. The crisis might be put in these terms. After the death of God, there are no longer any authoritative tables of value. Consequently, since the majority of human beings prove to be incapable of giving themselves because Nietzsche says the majority of human beings are incapable of recognizing the great and the noble and incapable of knowing themselves, peoples degenerate into the aforementioned systems of individual egoism. Nietzsche wryly notes that wisdom sets limits on knowledge too. So historicism, in either its progressive or nihilistic form, proves to be incompatible with life, according to Nietzsche. He claims the historical drive is only of value if there's a constructive or future-directed drive at work behind it. History is valuable only as raw materials, he says, to be utilized by the one who's going to shape the future. This means that what Nietzsche calls the critical approach to history, which is destructive of existing horizons, is only of value when there's a positive rather than a merely negative goal. This destructive effect must be a part of the need to create. To put it in the terms employed by Nietzsche's Zarathustra, the lion, i.e. the critical attitude, is valuable only if it precedes the creative child. The lion by itself destroys, however nobly it might do so, but the child is required to create. Nietzsche writes, history which only destroys will in the long run make its instruments blasé and unnatural. For such men destroy illusions, and whoever destroys illusion in himself and others will be punished by nature, the strictest tyrant. The illusions destroyed by the historical sense, Nietzsche is saying, are necessary. Human greatness requires them. He writes, quote, every people, even every man who wants to become ripe, needs such an enveloping madness, such a protective and veiling cloud. Without such illusions, the purposeless nature of life becomes apparent. These illusions are life-giving because they provide what Nietzsche calls a yes, a no, a straight line, a goal. They're needed because while there are a few who might be able to impose a goal or purpose on themselves in the face of the meaninglessness of life, a meaninglessness revealed by the transformation of progressive or Hegelian historicism into nihilistic historicism, or by the death of God, the majority of human beings, Nietzsche thinks, cannot. Thus, the fundamental question for Nietzsche is not the truth of a judgment or belief, but the value of it for life. What matters is the degree to which a given belief is, quote, life-promoting, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps even species-cultivating. And cultivation for Nietzsche is the highest in this list. In The Will to Power, Nietzsche notes that, quote, the standpoint of value is the standpoint of conditions of preservation and enhancement for forms of life. Certain judgments, though false, can cultivate and improve human beings. Furthermore, the falsest judgments, Nietzsche writes, quote, are the most indispensable for us. Without accepting the fictions of logic, without measuring reality against the purely invented world of the unconditional and self-identical, without a constant falsification of the world by means of numbers, man could not live. For all the dangers presented by historicism, then, Nietzsche is open to the possibility of overcoming it. Even, says Nietzsche, the suspicion that we are latecomers, quote, when grandly conceived, may vouchsafe great effects and hopeful desires for the future. This is a transformation of the deepest pessimism into the deepest optimism, a theme Nietzsche returns to in The Gay Science. After announcing the death of God, he asks, quote, do we not ourselves have to become gods merely to appear worthy of it? There was never a greater deed, and whoever is born after us will, on account of this deed, belong to a higher history than all history up to now. This deed calls to Nietzsche's philosophers of the future to become what they are. The solution may lie in seeing ourselves as the heirs of the heights of antiquity and consciously choosing to emulate the greatness of the ancients rather than live as what Nietzsche describes as, quote, the pale and feeble late arrivals of vigorous generations who eke out a frosty life as antiquarians and grave diggers of those generations. These late arrivals would be those whose Nietzsche's Zarathustra calls the last men. They, quote, live an ironic existence. Annihilation follows upon the heels of their limping course through life. They shudder at the thought of this annihilation as they enjoy the past, for they are living memories, but without heirs. Their memory is meaningless, so the dull inkling overcomes them that their life is an injustice, for no coming life can justify it. The historical sense then creates a sort of refinement in the last men. The last men don't learn from the past. They merely learn about it because there are no living questions anymore. Progressive historicism is the authoritative dogma of Nietzsche's age. This dogma teaches humanity to see itself, quote, as the peaks and targets of the world process. All things move humanity itself as the completion of nature. Nietzsche thinks this is dangerous. Quote, the overproud European of the 19th century, he writes, is not completed in his nature by this knowledge. Rather, it simply destroys that nature. This man of the historical sense, quote, climbs the sunbeams of knowledge upwards to heaven, but also downwards to chaos. With the loss of horizons that results from historicism or the death of God, there are no longer any justifications for any particular way of life. Knowledge loses a coherent center, and consequently, human beings learn about the world rather than from it. If they learned from the world and from the past, as Nietzsche does, they would recognize that their own historicism is dangerous to them. Instead, because they are the ones who live at history's end, they see themselves as the pinnacle of all history. Thus, Nietzsche writes, quote, even in the lowest depths of the sea, the historical universalist still finds traces of himself as living slime. High and proud he stands on the pyramid of the world process. As Zarathustra points out, such people are incapable of despising themselves. Because they view themselves as the pinnacle and culmination of the historical world process, they cannot see themselves with anything other than a kind of satisfaction. After all, they are the culmination of world history, and all things lead up to them. Because they are incapable of despising themselves, they are in fact the most contemptible, and they are incapable of self-overcoming or cruelty to the present self for the sake of a future self. This is because they either recognize no standards simply, or no standards that would compel them to change themselves. There has been, quote, a fraying of all foundations and a dissolution into an ever-flowing and dispersing becoming, where once standards had been based on the acceptance of something eternal. Now, Nietzsche is saying, all being seems to be simply becoming. And with that, all standards come to light as either arbitrary or, for those maintaining the secular Christian eschatology of historical progress, as overcome. The idolatry of the factual means acceptance of what is. Standards independent of one's own age would compel human beings to fight against their times. The last man of Nietzsche's Zarathustra merely accepts his age as the best of all possible ages. He's not good because there is a standard of goodness against which he measures himself, but simply because he lives at history's end. His is a privileged position, which allows him to look over the past as mere precursor, not to be taken seriously. As Nietzsche writes, he has nothing to do but continue to live as he has lived, to continue to love what he has loved, to continue to hate what he has hated, and to continue to read the newspaper which he has read. For him, there is only one sin: to live differently than he has lived. And that's the end. I am finished.
Michael, thank you so much. Can you guys still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm just want to tell the audience that they can pop their questions in the chat box for you, and that I'll be reading them to you. One thing that I love about the MLA program, Michael, is that students can take a philosophy course at the graduate level with no prior preparation, right? You don't need to have a BA in philosophy in order to take a course in philosophy in the MLA program. And yet what I found is that a lot of students are actually kind of scared to make that step. You know, is it going to be too hard? Are the texts going to be too difficult? Am I going to understand Nietzsche? Do you have any advice, you know, for students who are taking their first courses at the graduate level in philosophy for, you know, a demanding program like the MLA?
Yes, and maybe the first thing I would say is, while being intimidated by some of these texts is natural, we shouldn't let that stop us, because at the end of the day, these authors are simply human beings who are thinking about the most fundamental questions. And I really do mean the most fundamental. What is the nature of reality, and how should I live my life? And those are questions that I think are ultimately important for all of us. We all need to understand the world we live in, and we all need to be able to answer questions about how we're going to live our lives. What studying philosophy does is it allows you to spend a little time thinking about these things in a kind of dedicated and rigorous way. And chances are, most, if not all of us, have actually had the experience, certainly me when I was a teenager, granted I was a bit of a nerd, but had the experience of, you know, lying there at night, lying there at night, unable to sleep because you're trying to understand these things.
Yeah.
And the great thing about studying philosophy is there's a whole lot of people who tried to understand these very same questions before you, and they've spent 2,500 years arguing with each other about it. And you get to kind of jump into that argument and think through the various ways that people in the past have come to understand how they should live their lives and what the nature of reality is. And then you can think about how, if at all, that applies to your own answers to those two fundamental questions.
Yeah, and still, Michael, like when, because I'm teaching courses on philosophy too, somewhat related in critical theory. And so a lot of times, you know, when I assign Derrida or Foucault, and I have a student who comes back to me and says, "Oh, I mean, I had to reread that same sentence 5 times and I still don't understand it." How did you deal with it as a student? Like what kept you going?
So what kept me going was stubbornness, more than anything else, if I'm being really honest.
Yeah.
But what I tell students is that if they're reading like that, first of all, you do need to read this material more than once. But secondly, I tell students, if you're confused, it's because you're actually paying attention and you're trying to think through the argument. The person who reads it over once and doesn't have questions, isn't irritated by it, There's a famous story about Wittgenstein. I forget who he was reading, but he got so disgusted by it, he threw the book across the room. I mean, I'm not saying you need to have that kind of reaction, but if you're not having any reaction, it means that you're probably not reading it with the care that it needs to be read with. And if you're confused, this is what I tell students: this is good. It means you're paying attention. And the truth of the matter is, perplexity is really the beginning of our ability to understand the world. Aristotle comments that it is through wonder that just wondering about things in the world, that human beings begin to philosophize. And Nietzsche's point in part is that there's a lot of things that prevent us from having that experience of wonder. And one of the things that prevents us from having that experience of wonder is the sense that we've got it all figured out.
Yeah. And on the other side of the spectrum, if I may say, we have students who are absolutely fascinated and motivated by philosophy, and who want to transform that into a job, getting a PhD in philosophy, being a professor, becoming a philosopher. Do you have advice, since you became a professor of philosophy, do you have any advice for those students?
I mean, the truth is, I tend to think that I've landed on the Isle of the Blessed, and I really cannot believe that I make a living doing this. Yeah. My initial motive for
this is going to inspire a lot of our students, so you need to flesh it out. How did you get here? How did you get there?
So as I said, I was the kind of nerd who stayed awake at night wondering if color really exists, things like this. Mm-hmm. So I always had maybe a kind of bent toward philosophy. And when I completed my undergraduate degree in Texas, I went to work at a bookstore for 6 months. And I realized I'm going to be reading this stuff anyway. I'm going to be thinking about it anyway. I might as well see if I can get into a master's program. And it was after, I guess, let's say, getting my feet wet with a master's degree, as well as changing my focus. I initially wanted to focus on 20th century phenomenology. And then I got kind of railroaded by, I took a course on Plato's Laws. And then the next semester I took a course on Machiavelli. And I was just completely seduced by political philosophy, which ended up being my major focus. And I'm glad I did it. And I really do think that it's something that is unbelievably rewarding. And even if I hadn't managed to get a teaching position where I can make a living at it, I would think that it's still probably the best thing I've ever done in my life.
Yeah. And so, right after, let's say, a student graduates with the Master of Liberal Arts at Johns Hopkins University, what do you think is the next step for them?
Oh, well, I know quite a few of them go on to do PhDs. Yeah. I've written a number of letters of recommendation. Yeah. And I've had a few that have told me that they simply did it because they wanted to simply broaden their horizons.
Yeah, and let's say in when the student is trying to select a PhD program, do you have any kind of advice for them?
Yeah, my advice would be begin by looking at scholars whose work you have found to be valuable, insightful, impactful. So that would be where you begin. Find scholars who you think have done legitimately good and important work that addresses the sorts of questions that you're interested in. And then secondly, try to find out if they are actually taking students, because I've had a few friends that have ended up applying to programs where, they want to study under one specific person, and that person says, no, I'm not doing that anymore. So I think that's maybe the most important thing, is to identify, and then you have to kind of make I guess it's a balancing act, right? Because sometimes you might be better off going to a more prestigious program, even if it's not quite exactly what you want. So there tend to be these different trade-offs.
Thank you so much for those insights, Michael. Let's go back to the presentation a little bit. We have quite a few questions here in the chat box. What do you think, a question from Alan, what do you think is the social effect of Nietzsche's approach to historicism on us today?
Well, I would say, so broadly, I would say that first of all, Nietzsche does have a positive project. Now, whether he's quite successful at it, I think is a very different question. But he does have a positive project, which is to say that he wants to try to give us a kind of guidance through this kind of what he sees as this crisis. The social effect on it today, you know, I think he's half right, maybe. And what I mean is there does seem to be a lot of, let's say, misery in the depths of our unbelievable prosperity. I mean, we all live in a time and a place that, you know, for all the bad things in the world, it's vastly superior to the world our grandparents lived in. Yet we see people are extremely unhappy, and we see them act out in various ways because they have a sense that nothing really matters. I'm sure we can all think of specific examples of what this might look like just by, just think about the things we've seen on the news. For those of us in the DC and Baltimore region, just think about things we've seen on the news in the last 3 days. Here in DC, somebody called in bomb threats to a bunch of local schools. There were no bombs, but I think this is what people do. They have a sense that their life is meaningless, and they kind of assert themselves because of this. But because they don't necessarily think there are these kind of fundamental principles that ought to guide their actions and their assertions, they tend to assert themselves in what I think it's fair to call a kind of nihilistic way. Maybe the most extreme version of this is something like the Joker in Chris Nolan's second Batman film. That he's not motivated by anything, right? He's accepted that life is meaningless, and because life is meaningless, he's gonna. What does the butler say? Alfred says some men just want to watch the world burn.
I've forgotten about this. Another question here. We have plenty of questions. I'm going to try to select 2 or 3 before we stop. DH is asking, Nietzsche was at time miserable.
I owe him an email, I believe.
Or so it seems. Did you accept his misery, or did he hope for something more?
Nietzsche, one of the things Nietzsche is interested in doing is trying to find a way to take joy in seeing the world for what it is. So this is going to be kind of an oversimplification. But scholars tend to divide Nietzsche's work into 3 periods. There's the early period, where he's sometimes described as being interested in a kind of artist's metaphysics. Then there's the middle period, which is sometimes described as being his kind of positivist period. And I think what's really going on is in the early period, Nietzsche is trying to face up to the implications of historicism and the death of God and things like this. And his solution in the early period is to kind of make this turn towards an artist metaphysics. If we wanted to put this in terms of Plato, he's saying, we've got to redecorate the cave. We've come to see the cave is just a cave, so we need to redecorate it. Middle period Nietzsche is, as I said, he's a positivist in many ways, and he's trying to think through the implications of modern science and historicism and the death of God and things like this. And by the late period, which I would say maybe is seen most clearly in something like Zarathustra, he's come around to what I would say is almost a combination or a reconciliation of the project of the early and the middle period. And what I mean by that is, by the late period, he's realized that he needs to try to create a new metaphysic that is going to allow us to find joy in the face of what the world really is. So the early Nietzsche thinks we have to cover over what the world really is. The late Nietzsche thinks we have to kind of accept it, and then find a way to, as I put it during the paper, transform pessimism into optimism.
We have a question that's sort of related to that by Teresa. Teresa asks, Nietzsche must have changed his view on the importance of historical value in his later period. Do you know why? Any reasoning behind that? Is that true?
I think in his later period, he still recognizes the same kind of basic problem that he recognizes in something like the second meditation, the use and disadvantage of history for life. In the later period, though, he recognizes that what he calls the critical attitude can't be an end in itself. So tearing down, great figures of history, whatever they might be, so the three metamorphoses of the spirit in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche characterizes. There's the lion. Sorry, there's the dragon, the lion, the child. The dragon it slays. It tears down. I'm sorry, not the dragon. The lion tears down what's there, and then the child has to create. So the historical attitude, we might say, insofar as it culminates in historicism, the recognition of historical relativity, he thinks that's harmful. He thinks that's dangerous. Insofar as it leads to the creation of the future in a kind of positive way, whatever that might mean, and I think we'd probably disagree with him on this quite significantly. In that regard, it does have value. So the danger of historicism is that we realize that everything is culture. There isn't any kind of natural basis for the way we live our life. We can no longer say that things are right or wrong, good or bad. We can just say, well, they're different. And now, to be fair, he thinks that's true, right? He thinks there is no objective basis for good and evil, right and wrong, in the sense that we normally think about it. But he thinks that's bad for us. By the late period, he's trying to accept that truth and find a way for us to, let's say, live a joyful life, to justify our best practices without denying that truth. Maybe that's the way to put it.
We have many more questions, but we are running out of time. So, Michael, I want to thank you for sharing this great presentation with us, your knowledge on PhD programs, on becoming a philosopher, and on Nietzsche. I will forward those questions to you. And,
please do.
And I hope everybody will get an answer to their beautiful questions here. Thank you, Alexandra. Thank you, Peter, for producing the event. And I just want to tell the audience that we have also a wonderful event tomorrow at 6 with Shona Berkey, where we're going to talk about diversity and inclusion in public relations. Michael, thank you again.
Well, thank you. I've really enjoyed this. This is the first time I've done something like this, and I really appreciate the invitation.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.